Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Polarizing Conversations. Today we have a member of the Atlantic Changemakers Council of Inspiring Communities joining us, Shreetee Appadu, who is a queer, bisexual, non-binary settler of color from Mauritius who moved to Kjipuktuk in 2017 for their studies. They did a Bachelor in Environmental Studies with a minor in Geography at St. Mary's University and are very passionate about environmental justice, intersectionality, and community care. They are a member of the Racialized Student Academic Network, coordinated by Dr. Benita Bunjun, which is a closed space for racialized students and alumni. Racialized Students Academic Network also organized the Critical Indigenous Race Feminist Studies Student Conference, where Shreetee presented on the institutionalization of whiteness in universities, along with deconstructing whiteness in the environmental movement. They are currently the Outreach and Administration Coordinator at South House, which is a sexual and gender resource center, along with being one of the residence coordinators at St. Mary's University. They love to create spaces that prioritize 2SQT, BIPOC, joy, and relationships, and love to read and dance. Welcome, Shreetee.
Hello.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And so I know we chatted earlier this week to agree on a guiding question for our conversation, and we landed on one which I think is super interesting and is going to be super interesting for our guests. And the question is, how might we decentralize our stories? So I'm curious to hear what that means for you.
Yeah, lot to say about that. How might we decentralize our stories? So, as you mentioned, I moved here in Kjipuktuk, also called as so-called Halifax, in 2017. A little came here for my studies. And in terms of, I had an idea of how so-called Canada would be in my head. Because it was always portrayed as very welcoming and, very friendly. And some of it is true. It is welcoming and friendly, but it's also the part of, we are on Indigenous territory, and they are still suffering from the impact of colonization. And this part, we were not made a lot of immigrants and newcomers are not told about this and do not know about this part of so-called Canada story, which I think should be told, right? Which is not the case. So kind of like decentralizing our stories in terms of who is telling the stories, and how can we get it to be more open and hear different parts of the stories.
Yeah, and then it's interesting. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I was reading actually some of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action yesterday for a program that I'm running, and some of the calls to action are around how newcomers are briefed when they arrive to Canada and the oath that you take in Canadian citizenship ceremonies. So this is all from people arriving to Canada, and then there's also the perspective of people who arrive here. Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack in those stories that we hear.
Yeah, and also me doing environmental studies, and I really, really enjoyed it. But still, there was a lot of the part, there was it did center a lot of white environmentalists and the environmental movement in the West. That was mostly led by white environmentalists and did not really give a lot of space to the Indigenous communities and with other racialized communities. Even in here, in Kjipuktuk, we have Africville, and so the African discussion that is kind of not included in that environmental history until very recently, with the success of The Salting in the Water by Dr. Ingrid Waldron. Now people are starting to talk more about it, and then we're talking more about environmental racism and the impact of it. But before that, there was conversations, but it was certain groups of people. It wasn't very common as it is now, which I guess is a good thing that now we're talking more about it and being more aware of it. But considering, when you look at the history a little bit of so-called Canada and the history of the environmental movement, which I like to kind of like say that is kind of like two-part, and maybe we're in the third movement. You had the conservation movement in the 19th century with the creation of parks, along with the, more like a modern environmental movement in the 20th century, where it will look more at the impact of people on the environment. But all those narratives kind of leaves behind the Indigenous communities and racialized communities that have been fighting since the very beginning for their land and for access to clean and drinking water, against pollution. And that happened the moment of contact, right here in so-called Canada on Turtle Island. Indigenous communities have been talking about the impact of colonization, of capitalism on the environment, but they were not given the space to do that until like other white environmentalists said the same thing in a way, and then people started to be like, oh yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in some ways I suppose I understand decolonialism as, who gets to tell their stories, or not even maybe tell their stories, but whose stories, to your point, get heard. And I do think that is polarizing in today's society, as it feels like people are fighting to have their stories told. And as you think about that, and the studies that you've done in the environmental movement, you've spoken a little bit about stories that aren't heard until someone else amplifies them. I'm wondering if you could help us understand from your perspective how we might, I think the question is, how might we, be more open to hearing different stories that we're not used to hearing?
I think the amplifying is good, but I think we need to give credits to those communities, right? It shouldn't be termed like as a new thing. And then also, like in the environmental movement, we'll very much look in the environmental movement, but we look at the climate crisis, and it's like, oh, it's people's consumption and individual people. It's kind of put it on like individual people's responsibility to consume a certain way, when it's the system that we're in that causes people to consume a certain way, right? So we need systemic change. But back to the amplification, it's good that it's amplified, but it's a credit, right? The credit should go to the fight that the Indigenous communities and other racialized communities have done, and that's what's kind of missing on it. Then the fact that with the modern environmental movement, there was this in here. I talk mostly from like a lot of my studies and research have kind of been done focusing at Turtle Island, which is like so-called Canada and North America, which is also, there's like they have their stories, and then I haven't looked into the Global South stories and the movement that have been led there regarding and the protection for the environment, which I know there's so many of it. So that's already one way that's like, okay, what are we centralizing? Whose stories are we centralizing? Which usually is mostly like North American and Western stories that gets the highest like pedestal, I would say, the podium. But yeah, so I think, so the amplifying good is just a credit, right? And then it's just like involving the people, involving the communities. Don't just sit at the table. Bring a chair for them to sit at the table. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like that. It's inviting people to the table.
Oh, and I think also sometimes it's also important that maybe the table, we just need to break the table and build a new one, right? Maybe because sometimes there's been so much harm that's been done to communities that just inviting them to sit at the table is not enough. We need to build a whole new table involving them and building that table together. So then it's more like a process that's done together. and then they get to they get to have a say as well on how to build that table, what will work for them, what will work for us, and then work it out together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you said that, I thought about the adage or the saying, "Don't build a bigger fence, build a bigger table."
Yeah.
When you have a lot of resources, or in this case, power to be able to tell stories.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize the power dynamic that exists, right? Because they're recognizing that it will happen, and by that I mean the impact of colonization on the world, on communities, and how it robbed them of a lot of their power, and how can we give them that power back. And it's not a conversation that happens just we just decide, it's like it's together. And also just listening. They've been talking, like, and I know, a lot of indigenous communities and racialized, like, African Nova Scotian communities here, they've been, like, they have the solutions there. They know what they need. You just need to listen and work with them to give them what they need. And that works as well for racialized communities, and that works as well for, newcomers and immigrants who are coming here. I lived here for 5 years of my life, and it's not been the most easiest thing. I had great experience, but I also have, not so great experience. And I think, like, a part of that's lacking is the ability to listen to what is being asked to do. Even the Truth and Reconciliation document that has, like, is it 99 calls to action?
94, I think.
94, and that was published in 2015.
Yeah,
okay. And 94 calls to action, and with 2022, so 7 years later, and I think it's not even like a third of it that's completed, which is appalling, because these are calls to action that have been consulted with Indigenous communities that are, like, actively asking the government, these are the things you need to do to build the relationship back with the communities. And we're like, here we are 7 years later. And so you can see the priority, right? And it's kind of like, whose voice are we actually centering? Yes, we did this calls to action. We did the studies, we involved communities, but then when it comes to actually doing the action, it's just taking so long. So then there's just like it breaks the trust. It doesn't help build trust. It just breaks the trust.
Yeah, I want to pull on a couple of threads that you mentioned, one about trust and one about listening. I think, so I'm trained as a teacher, and I'm not sure how much we train people on the skill of listening. And I do think that, I believe that listening is a skill that we have to practice. It's not something that, some people, I think, are better at it than others. And even if you're saying something, because of the way that I've moved through the world, I could be hearing it differently than you're saying it. And so I think that listening is an interesting skill, and I'd love for you to dive a bit deeper on that. And before I pass it back over to you, I just wanted to add the layer of, I think, as it relates to polarizing conversations, one of the things that gets in the way of listening, especially listening to some of the stories of people who've had systemic barriers, like the groups that you mentioned, is fear. It's fear that if I make space for someone else, maybe that means that there's going to be negative consequences for me. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, how we can better or maybe better our listening skills as it relates to this. And I think in order to do that, perhaps we have to decrease our fear by, I heard this thing that someone said once, and I don't remember who, so I can't attribute it, but they said you can't be both curious and judgmental at the same time. So it's like, oh, that's great. So, it's like that constant practice of asking yourself, am I being curious or judgmental? And that judgment comes from fear options. So Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about listening and fear and how that relates to our stories, for the stories that we hear.
Yeah, I think I think it might be very important to decentralize ourselves to better be able to listen.
I love that. Yeah.
Right? Because it's when you were listening, it's no longer about us, right? It's about the other person. And to do that, it shouldn't be. And I think that's what the issue is sometimes, even in conflict, right? Is like a lot of things are taken personally, and then it just weighs on you, because we kind of centralize ourselves. And that's also the case when we hurt someone,
Right.
right? And then we apologize, and then it's totally within the right of the other person if they don't want to forgive you. But I there was like, I wish I remember, but I had a presentation that talked about the it's kind of like the skeletal of apology, like the structure of an apology. I think it's by I forgot. Again, I can give the credit because I can't remember.
If you think about it later and you want it
Yeah,
to include in the show notes.
I will. But it kind of gives like a 5 steps, right, of how to apologize, and it's again, I don't remember the specific 5 step, but I will look it up and send it to you because I think it's very important. That kind of decentralize ourselves and kind of focuses more on not even on the other person, but more on how you want to move that relationship with that other person forward, right?
Right.
Because it's like it's not just one person; it's the two of us that has a relationship. Or when you look at community and we talk about community care, it is together that we're able to sustain that caring. It shouldn't just fall on one person, but together as a community, how are we gonna, hold the space for us? How are we gonna maintain it? And how are we gonna, if something happens, how are we gonna deal with it? How are we gonna call out people in a way that doesn't ostracize them or put them away? And I think that's also like, it's like to decentralize ourselves and focus more on that relationship a bit.
Yeah, I recently heard someone, Rachel Rogers, who's an entrepreneur, a Black entrepreneur in the U.S., differentiate between calling out and calling in, and that you can call out and then call in. So it's like, this behavior hurts me because X, and I'm calling you in to create a better future through Y, which is in some ways what you're saying about, well, it potentially is some ways what you're saying about that all of the, different communities have their own solutions or ways that they want to create this better future, but we have to be willing to navigate to that future together. So we have to call each other in to be able to do that. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I do agree with it. I mean, I'm still navigating, how to do that, how to do the call out, how to do the call in. And it's not easy. And there's also so much hurt, right? And and when we looked at, a lot of racialized communities here in so-called there's so much hurt that have been inflicted to those communities, inflicted to, so it's how do you manage the hurt and the trauma that come from that, and still build as a relationship and still build community. And a lot of the time it is, I can speak from my experience, because I, being the outreach and admin coordinator at CIRFS, my focus is really to create a lot of closed spaces for Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks, and also, queer racialized folks in kjipuktuk, because for me personally, I felt there's a lack of it, right? I don't know where to connect with my fellow community members, and I want to be able to connect with them, because, it's just a lot of pain and that I've experienced navigating through this world, being a racialized queer immigrant person. So, and I know connecting with other people, not just to talk, and it's not to talk just about the bad things that happen. Let's talk about the great things that happen. It's a sense of joy in relationships and, make friends and just go grab a bite and just connect and exist in a way that sometimes this world does not want us to exist. But that also involves, right, being able to navigate relationships and being able to call in, call out, because people are not perfect. No one is perfect, right? We will make mistakes, but it's just I don't think it shouldn't be the end of the world to make mistakes. But how do we navigate this, right? And it's also, of course, different for different groups of people, right? The tolerance is different, especially if you have, again, as the power dynamics are when we're in a post-colonial, but for so-called Canada, we could say we're in a colonial state, right? At least that's how I see it, and that's how a lot of Indigenous elders and the grassroots grandmothers here, they've all been saying the same thing, because they don't have the independence, they don't get to have a say on how the land is going to be used. So we're very much in a colonial state. So when there is this power dynamic, and when there's so much harm that's done against racialized folks, the tolerance to be open or accepting or forgive is not there anymore, because that's what is expectation from us, right? Is to always you're allowed to make mistake, and amid mostly towards the white folks, and Sarah Ahmed talk about the institutionalization of whiteness, which I kind of did present on at one of the conference, and it tells that it becomes so normalized. Whiteness is so normalized, and it's in the background, right? That whoever is especially in universities and a lot of organization, they don't see that as an issue, and they don't see how that keeps people out and causes harm to people.
Yeah. There's so many threads I'd like to pull on, and yeah, in terms of my own story navigating the world as a white person, I have seen the institutionalization of whiteness, in the sense I traveled with a racialized person for a while, and we had entered a number of countries together, and he got randomly selected for a search in every country we entered, and I never did.
That's randomly in quotation mark, because we all know it's not random.
Yeah, I was like, I don't think this is random, considering every time, and it never happens to me. Yeah, and it was interesting when I traveled as a young woman solo. I often got stopped, and I don't anymore. So I'm I'm approaching, I guess, middle age, in the sense that I'm 40, and as I've traveled now through the world, I present in a different way than I did when I was younger, and I find I can very easily move through the world. And as I'd like to pull on one thing that you said that I thought was really interesting, how do we decentralize ourselves? Part of my own journey has been acknowledging that power, and at times when I've seen it, it's been surprising to me, because I haven't experienced that, so I don't know what it's like to have that happen on a very regular basis. And so as we decentralize ourselves, no matter what frame of reference we're starting in, what advice do you have for people?
As we decentralize, I don't know, I find the term intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, can be really helpful in terms of understanding about intersectionality, right? Because he talks about identities, race, gender, class, and all of this helps kind of position yourself where you are at. And I think the positioning ourselves where we're at in this system can help us decentralize ourselves. And I think, it's a very hard thing to do individually. But it is something, because it's uncomfortable. You're going to put yourself out of your comfort zone. But I think this is important. I think more and more people should do it if we want to actually, get to a world that is equitable for everyone. people need to do that work of like putting them out of their comfort zone, know about their identities, learn about it, and talk about it with other people, right? Acknowledge it, as like you said, you acknowledge it, and I think that's on the right path. That's on the right path. Because also by acknowledging, in a way, you are breaking down the system little by little, because it doesn't, like, the colonial system, white supremacist system we're in doesn't want you to acknowledge that, right? It doesn't want people in power to acknowledge that they have power, and they're going to work to make sure that they distribute the power. But I think that's how we should approach it.
I think a lot of people, this is a conjecture, but I think a lot of people would say, at least in private, that they don't believe an equitable world is possible. What would you say to that?
No, I think, I don't think it's possible under capitalism. That's true. Because, just the very notion of capitalism, that it's based on the exploitation of the environment and of growth on a limited resource, because, it's like you always need to make profits, and it's just not sustainable. But see, capitalism is not the only way to be. And I think that's what we need to get out of. It's not, it has been the way that people, that we've been functioning because we had no choice. But I think moving forward, we need to be like, okay, how do we break it down? How do we make it fall? How do we kind of think of capitalism as an empire? It will eventually fall. But it's just like, what steps do you or can you take to make it fall? And it doesn't have to be really big steps, right? It's just locally being aware of what is happening in your community. And, it can be sharing the information, talking about what's happening with your friends, with your family, and have those difficult conversation, right? And slowly we will, like, bring down capitalism. I believe in that. I know. I don't know if it will happen in my lifetime, but there's hope. I have hope. And funnily enough, me and my friend was talking the other day. It's like, oh, if we look at it as empire, all empires have fallen, right? There hasn't been one empire that stayed. But also, it's just like, I also don't believe that there will be one way of being for all the communities across the world. And I think that's what capitalism have failed, right? It imposed one way of being for everyone. Yeah, and moving forward, that's what we need to break down is we don't need to find something else to replace capitalism. We just need to find what works for each community. And how we do that is, again, by, being in community. Which, again, capitalism doesn't let you, because you have to survive, you have to get a job, and you're exhausted at the end of the day. You don't have time to involve yourself in community.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's so much there, too. Like, yeah, just the being a community part. I feel like we've lost that in some way. And it's funny because my dad was born in Italy, and we went back as a family in 2019. And one thing that I noted that was different there, in every household that we visited almost, the elderly parents of my dad's generation, their parents were living with them. So there were, often 2 to 3 generations living together. And here we often see people living in assisted care or assisted living facilities, which are great for people that need a lot of care, but they're sometimes take people away from their community. So there's, I think, a lot to heal even within the way that we live within our families. And to that point, I think capitalism encourages people to, to go where the opportunities are. And I like what you said about the allowing different ways of being. And I think that's it's a radical notion almost.
I don't know, as a queer person and non-binary person, it's just like, it's just, let me be, right? Because the dominant narrative is being straight, being cis, being heteronormative, which again has been, is a result of colonization, right? Because we look back at history, there's been so many communities, that lived with queer people, and then here itself, you have in many indigenous communities, right? They have the Two-Spirit people who was very much part of that community, right? They were not ostracized, they were not put apart, or like or made to feel different. They were like, oh, you're part of that community, and I think that's
an essential part, right?
An essential part of that community.
Yeah.
Which when when the colonizers came, they destroyed that, and that's what I mean when we have communities that are, it's like the generational trauma and the generational hurt, and the distrust that exists in communities, that we need to tackle that. I think my mentor and friend, Dr. Benita Bunjun, kind of talked about the importance of relationship and trust, and how we need to work, to gain the trust. We can't just think that they will trust us. And I think that's also how we need to approach to do things. When there's a new project, and then people do public consultation, and then they're like, oh, but no people of that communities came or whatever. But it should be like, but why did they not come, right? What happened in the past that made them just trust you and not trust you anymore? That they would not come even though you give them the space, right? It's not just about creating the space, it's about creating and building that relationship again. And that also involves decentralizing ourselves, but also know about our position. The positionality is very important. And to acknowledge the power dynamic. It's just like a lot, but I think it's just like, it's, and I think that is, we're getting there, as people, the term intersectionality is becoming more popular, people understanding it more, but we just need to be careful that we're not tokenizing it or just using that word everywhere with no actual follow-up of the meaning or taking action to it, which happened. And I can talk of an example, right? Like with the Black Lives Matter movement that happened in 2020, we've seen a lot of EDI implementation, right? Equity, diversity, and inclusion. But then sometimes those very policies can be used to harm racialized folks when they bring something that's like, and I had friends who went through that, right? It's just like, they said it kind of like, it's like calling out, but then it's being told you can't do it like that, or because you did it like that, your concerns are not being taken into consideration, which is the exact opposite of what needs to be done, right? And also the work of knowing how to call out people, I don't think should fall on racialized folks either, right? Especially not on Indigenous communities here in the African Nova Scotia community here, because they've already been screaming and telling everyone what they need. At this point, we can just expect them to, at least that's how I see it, is like their anger is valid, right? Their distress is valid because they've just been left behind by the system. And like as a newcomer here, like as an immigrant, it's, I understand that. And also just look at the narrative around, the Indigenous communities. It's very much, it's they're still left behind, right? It's kind of like, as you mentioned, now I don't know what is the process when you become citizenship, but I think they touch a little bit about the history of Indigenous communities, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be from like a decolonizing perspective, right? Because it's the colonial state that imposed it, so of course they don't want to make themselves look like the bad guys.
Yeah, there's a lot in there too. And one thing that I was thinking about was, and it's hard almost because I'm thinking about history and how we study history, which is stories. And then as it relates to what you've talked about with, let's say, being or even knowing about Indigenous people in Canada or Turtle Island who identified as Two-Spirit. And that, even when we say Indigenous, there's a whole range of cultures that incorporates. But then, as we work to decentralize ourselves, part of that is, I think, potentially the study of history, or at minimum, the study of different cultures or different ways of being throughout the world. And at minimum, getting curious about that.
Yes, for sure. Curiosity is it's very important. And also it's just like not be in just our own bubble, right? It's like, this is how we do things, this is how things should be. And when you look, like, you think of capitalism, you look at this societal normative word, it's like a bubble, right? Anybody who doesn't fit the way they want them to fit is an outsider. And that's how, right? And it's just like, no, right? Why do we only have one way of being? When in the history of human, of what we know, we've never had just one way of being. We do have one now because of colonization, but the different cultures across the world live very differently. But that's what the colonizers did, right? The one was like, oh, you don't do things the way I do, so that means you're uncivilized, right? They went to, so many countries in Africa, like all of Africa, and then in Asia, India, and just caused so much harm and forced them to be a certain way, which is not the way that those communities live. So then you kind of lost that part. And, I'm the descendant of indentured laborers. So my ancestors came from India. And then, so after the abolition of slavery, they still had to run the plantations. They still needed people and they still needed laborers. So what they did, they moved people from India across and moved them to the different islands. And and it was, people that was already suffering under capitalism, under colonization. They moved them to a different place where they also suffered again. But then we were like, okay, so there was this method of survival that, they wanted to survive, they needed to survive. And I'm in a position, thanks to my ancestors, that, it's just like, I don't want to be again in that position of just I'm fighting to survive in a world that doesn't want me to survive. Right. But this is what capitalism does, right? It's just like, you're just always in survival because you have to work, you have to pay your rent, and you have all the other bills you got to do, and then you don't have time to spend time in community because you just have to be like, okay, I'm gonna go, which is not sustainable. And then also, as racialized people, we face microaggression, we face racism, we face xenophobia, there's so many things we face. So along with having to survive, we carry all this trauma with us, which makes it really, really hard. And that's what happens, it's like, you need to, people need to learn about those things because otherwise we won't get anywhere. But also, in this age of social media, pay the creators, especially the racialized creators that are giving you this information. If you can't pay, share this information, talk about it, give credits to them. Like all of this, talk about their name, say their name out loud. And I think all of this helps in moving away from this bubble, right, of capitalism. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like it. So, as a potentially last question, one of the things one of my big takeaways is how do we decentralize ourselves? And for me, that starts with, in order to hear other people's stories, we first have to acknowledge the perspectives that we're coming from. And let's say for me on my mom's side, we have British descendants and French. And even as colonialists, we inflicted trauma on our own people by things like homeschool or home children, where people who couldn't afford their children literally sent them to the colonies. And that obviously has generational trauma. And so, I think part of it is resolving some of this trauma for ourselves to be able to see the trauma that we're inflicting on others. And so, whether that's studying history, whether that's seeking other stories of people who are not like us, I'm wondering, what advice do you have for people to decentralize their stories or decentralize themselves as they move forward so that we're able to create this more equitable society that you're talking about?
That's a very good question. I think it's also important to acknowledge that being an oppressor and being oppressed can coexist, right? It's not independent of each other. And I look at this, also from like a brown person, and in the brown communities, there's a lot of anti-Blackness, right? And while we're still being oppressed, we are still, contributing to the oppression. Yeah. And I think it's important to acknowledge this. And in this world that kind of is like very individualistic, I would say, involve yourself in community. Reach out, talk to people, make time. Or it doesn't have to be anything. It doesn't have to be a big thing, right? You could just text a friend after work, be like, do you want to make dinner together? Do you want to watch this movie that was directed by an Indigenous director or a Black director? Do you want to watch this movie that talks about residential school? But come over and make dinner, watch this movie, and then maybe discuss, talk about it, and then watch something else, right? It's not like the work doesn't just have to be bad or hard, right? You can center joy in that as well. And I think that's very important. You have to center joy, because otherwise it will be impossible. And I've kind of learned this, the hard way, doing like community work and just navigating the world that we are. That this world does not want me or you to thrive, right? It only gives like a specific group of people who can see the 1% who will thrive. So how do you thrive in this world? But it is very much by centering joy and centering community and centering, like, decentralizing ourselves. But also to do that, we need to know about ourselves, what we need. And I think knowing about ourselves, about our positionalities, where we stand in this world, will help with decentralizing ourselves. So
I love that. Yeah. How do we have those difficult conversations with ourselves? And then I like the final takeaway of really centering joy, because I think that that's so important in all of these things. And I think if joy is centered, then perhaps it might reduce polarization.
Yes. And, in a lot of the very anti-capitalist movement, in a lot of those movement, there is joy that's centered, right? People are singing, people are dancing. There's food around, because that's what keeps us going. That's what helps what gives the energy to do the work, to keep doing the work, because we're centering joy along with tackling this very difficult topic.
I love that. Thank you so much for this conversation, Shreetee. If people would like to connect with you, is there a best place where they can find you?
Well, I'm at South House right now, but I can guarantee that I'll be there. But they could maybe reach out to you, and then you could reach out to me, because you have my contact as well.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for episode 3 of Polarizing Conversations. I hope you had some really great takeaways. Maybe it was decentralizing yourself and what that means in terms of intersectionality, or how to center joy in these very difficult processes and in these polarizing conversations. I hope you'll join us for episode 4 coming out in a couple of weeks. Have very exciting guests coming up. And as always, I hope you'll subscribe and share the episodes on whatever podcast platform that works best for you. Thanks so much for joining us.